Well, this is Dr. Stan here at Radio Liberty, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay, and bringing you the news behind the news, the story behind the story. Hoping to convince you that reality is usually scoffed at and that illusion is usually king. But in the battle for survival of Western civilization, it's going to be reality, not illusion or delusion, that will determine what the future will bring. And I need to remind you the views expressed here are not necessarily those of the owners, management, staff, sponsors, or supporters of the station you're listening to. They happen to be my views. And, well, of course, for the next hour, they're going to be the views of our good friend Joel Skousen. And these are exciting times, especially if you watched and saw what happened to the stock market yesterday. If you watched and saw what happened to the stock market today and to the prices of gold and silver, I have not seen such wide swings in the price of gold and silver, and I've been watching this for nigh on pretty close to 50 years. Amazing things are happening in our capital markets, and I don't know whether Joel's going to address that today. There are lots of things to address. So let's just see what Joel's going to be talking about. Hi, Joel Skousen. How are you?
I'm just fine, Dr. Stan, and indeed we are going to talk about the Operation Twist and the new loss of confidence in the Fed.
All right, fine. Well, you just go ahead and pick up the story, and you're going to have to explain to most people what Operation Twist is, because it's a pretty twisted concept, but go right ahead.
I will do that. But the Fed is now the laughingstock of the investment world, and the markets are reacting with a degree of panic. The U.S. and European markets dropped over 5% in the last 2 days. And all this came after losses earlier in the week. Stock markets around the world are heading for declines similar to the beginning of the financial global crisis in 2008. Well, there's actually no reason why the market should have been rebounding in the interim, except that the speculative economy had a lot of money to invest. They got it from the Fed. They got it from the bailout of the big banks. And they felt assured that large inputs from the government-connected plunge protection team, which is Goldman Sachs, Chase, and other insider banks, would keep markets rising. Well, eventually the secondary bubble had to burst, which is what we're seeing right now, and I think that's just what's going on. Worse, there seems to be a general uncertainty across all markets, and that's bearish for everything but gold and silver, which are reaching for new highs. The dollar's resurgence in the past week is only a reflection of the weakness of the euro, nothing else. Well, the big mistake of Bernanke's harebrained scheme to tweak the yields on long-term versus short-term bonds, this is we're getting to Operation Twist, really kind of made the Fed look like it had run out of decent options. That's what's happening according to TheStreet.com. It says the worldwide sell-off following the Treasury Reserve announcement Wednesday that it was rejiggering its holdings of Treasury bonds, called the Twist by many, in its latest bid to spur the economy by lowering interest rates. Many analysts, however, doubt the Fed action will have any measurable effect, and investors were spooked by the Fed's bluntly worded warning that, quote, significant downside risk to the economic outlook was imminent. Well, Operation Twist is what investors and economists call the Fed's planned sale of short-term holdings and switching to purchasing of long-term U.S. debt. Now, what that does basically is when they dump short-term holdings that the Fed has been purchasing in various QE plans, that decreases the value of those, and then they purchase or transfer that money over to long-term debt, and that makes it look like long-term debt is more in demand. It's twisting the yield curves of each toward longer-dated bonds. Now, this is exactly the opposite of what the real market would do. The real market keeps going towards shorter bonds because they don't trust the inflation numbers the Fed is putting out. Nobody's willing to lend long because they don't trust inflation. And so the Fed is trying to twist the market and make it appear as if more people are demanding long-term bonds than short-term. And nobody's buying it. It's just a transparent hoax, and it really has caused a loss of confidence in the Fed.
All right, we're going to be back in just a moment with Joel Skousen as we begin to try to analyze what's going on. Ladies and gentlemen, we're living in tumultuous times, and you better start making your preparations accordingly. Well, this is Dr. Stan here at Radio Liberty, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay. Our guest this afternoon is, so often on Thursdays, is Joel Skousen, and we're talking about what's happening financially. And Joel was explaining that the latest escapade by the Federal Reserve System is known as the twist. And that is, of course, to twist the bond rates, the interest rates on long-term bonds and short-term bonds. Ordinarily, long-term bonds are more expensive, higher interest rates, pay higher interest rates than short-term bonds because, well, of course, people are uncertain about certainly whether they're even going to get paid off or the value of the dollar when, of course, they get their money back. And so ordinarily they want a higher interest rates. So Ben Bernanke, in his wisdom, is going to get lower interest rates on the long-term bonds and higher rates on the short-term bonds. And who in heaven's name is going to buy these long-term bonds when there's a very definite loss of confidence in the value of the currency? Joel, who is going to buy these long-term bonds?
Well, nobody is, actually. They thought that the fact that they could push the price or the yield lower below its current 2% just isn't going to work. Oliver Persh says when you have 10-year Treasury yield already below 2%, you're not going to drive it much lower no matter what you do. So it really discredits Bernanke and the Fed more than anything else that I've ever seen, and it just isn't working. I mean, he's trying, obviously, to lower housing mortgage costs to try to induce a housing recovery, but it has just been so transparently weak and ineffective that it's doubtful that it's going to have much effect at all.
Well, many people have been saying for some time that basically, of course, a lot of foreigners are not buying long-term bonds. A few of them are. Other countries are buying them. But that the Fed surreptitiously, by various devious means, is actually buying up our own debt. I mean, it sounds great, look, we're selling all these bonds, but we're actually giving the money to other countries so they can buy up our bonds. And you can't keep, of course, creating money to buy up your own debt. You can't keep buying up your own debt indefinitely, where the whole thing collapses.
Well, that's right, and that's why, rather than come in with a QE3 where they were going to buy debt, they decided to try this little twist of selling some of the debt they bought in short term and putting the money into long-term bonds in order to try to manipulate the yield curves of the market. But as I say, it isn't working. Investors around the world have come to the same conclusion. If Operation Twist proves to be largely ineffective, the question is, does that mean Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke is out of magic bullets?
Hold that thought. We'll learn in just a moment here. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Joel is just saying that the idea of the twist, this latest idea of the Federal Reserve System to try to preserve a totally fiat money system, upon which our entire economy is built upon, and the savings of the American people and the pensions of the American people and the money markets and the banking system, trying to preserve this by the so-called twist is not working, and people throughout the world are manifesting their total loss in confidence in the American monetary system by what's been happening in Europe with a drop in their stock markets over there this past week, and what's happening in America this last couple of days. So pick up the story, Joel, please, because I think that it's so vitally important that people understand we're in real trouble, and if they don't act and act quickly, why many of the people listening to this program are going to end up impoverished. And certainly in very, very poor physical shape, financial shape in the months that lie ahead. Go right ahead.
Well, pundits say in response to the question, has he run out of bullets, that they don't think so. He says they can always widen the discount window again. Now that's the ability to loan to banks so that they can throw money out to the public. But as I say, once again, banks are very reluctant at whatever interest rate to lend to the public. They just as soon turn around and reinvest it with the Fed and get a guaranteed 3% interest than they would risk loaning to people at 4 to 5% interest. They claim that they can always guarantee levels of debt. They talk about going out and actually buying mortgage bonds and collateralized mortgage debt. But these are now viewed as tried and failed tactics, especially tinkering with mortgage bonds, which have a deadly reputation. The only ammunition that the Fed has is raw inflation of the money supply, and it's already using it to the max. There are limitations, however, to this ultimate inflationary weapon. Interest rates can only be suppressed as long as the perceived rate of inflation is kept within 5 points or so of the real rate of inflation. When bankers, for example, and investors realize that the government has been lying about the inflation rate, they won't be willing to lend 4% when the real rate of inflation is actually 7 to 10%. But it's amazing how very few people, I think there are a lot of people who know that the government is lying, but anybody who's a economist for one of the big banks don't dare mention, they'd get fired if they mentioned the government was fudging the interest rate. And so they have to play along. And as long as everyone else plays along, they think that they're safe. But it's kind of like a Ponzi scheme. When it starts to drop and everybody realizes, gee, inflation's really 7 to 10%. What are we doing loaning money at 4%? Boards of directors are going to explode. Well, what the Fed has going for it on the upside is that all other currencies are fiat currencies and are inflating almost as fast as the dollar. Now, the Fed can get away with more inflation than the European Central Bank or the Bank of London, in that international base of dollars is approximately 8 to 10 times larger than any other currency. So $1 trillion created in America or by the Fed shows up less inflationary than the creation of 1 trillion euros. The U.S. dollar got that advantage by being a gold redeemable currency for so many years, up until 1976. Then it betrayed all the holders of dollars by reneging on its contract in 1976. But by then, the world was stuck with all those dollars and had no place else to go. The Fed has been taking advantage of that all these years. That's how the U.S. got to be a reserve currency, by promising gold in return, and then they reneged on that. But they'd already got that position, and once you get it, it's not like people can just trade their dollars in, because if everybody started to do that, you would lose the value of the remaining dollars. The market would start to collapse. If China tried to unload their dollars, by the time they'd unloaded $100 billion, the market would be down 50%, and they would lose too much, and that's why they don't dump dollars, except slowly. They're trying to buy commodities. They're buying anything in the world they can with those dollars, and that's why it's inflationary, because most of our inflation is coming from prices overseas, raw goods and materials that are inflating the prices here at home. Actual price inflation at home is still around 5 to 6%. And yet inflation of the dollar worldwide is up at 7 to 10%, sometimes as high as 20% on raw materials. A lot of foodstuffs are that high. Well, the Fed knows all this and is inflating to the maximum, testing the limits of inflation perception. Now, despite all the talk about deflation, we are still inflating. That's an interesting point, too. During periods when prices are deflating, either through cheap imports from China or through a recession, this is important to remember, the Fed can get away with a lot more money creation because at least half of it gets swallowed up by deflationary forces. In other words, remember all the past 20 years when we were getting all those Chinese goods and prices were falling. But if the Fed hadn't been inflating at the same time, prices would have been double as low, twice as low. You see what I mean? In other words, they were robbing us of the real benefit of those cheaper prices by inflating at the same time. And we were satisfied because we thought everything was hunky-dory with lowering cost of computer prices. But it would have been a lot lower without inflation. As Max Slavo points out, uncertainty is crippling any chance of recovery. The most important sign of that is that corporate and government-connected insiders have gotten out of the market. That's got to tell us something about the severity, Stan, about what's around the corner. In the grand scheme of things, he says, it really doesn't matter to those of us who have taken our assets off the table and have chosen instead to get physical. He's talking about buying gold. But there are still millions of Americans who are depending on stocks for their livelihoods and retirement. Most retirement funds are invested in bonds and in the stock market. So for those who are wondering what the sentiment on Wall Street is, consider why the insiders have quit buying stocks. Chief executives, board members, head honchos of hedge funds, the people in the know, just a few weeks ago, they were out in force buying up shares in their own companies with both hands. No longer. They've disappeared almost overnight. They've stopped buying, says Charles Biderman, chief executive of stock market research. Insiders aren't buying this rally. Insider stock purchases, which have surged above 100 million a day in the market slump last month, have now collapsed to just 13 million a day. And he was talking about last week. So it's obvious that the insiders knew this slump was coming and they got out earlier while people were still buying. Meanwhile, the ratio of insider sales to purchases has skyrocketed. Today, insiders are dumping $7 in stock for every $1 that they're buying. That's a worrying ratio. 6 weeks ago, the amounts of purchase and sales were about equal. So what's up? Well, he says maybe they're worried about the big picture. Greece, China, the U.S. economy, the budget, any number of things could cause the stock market to throw a wheel. But Biderman blames uncertainty. It looks to me like insiders are uncertain as to what's going to happen. Now, when that happens, and this is my commentary, it means that the Fed can no longer guarantee them immunity from the ultimate consequences that loose money policies have wrought for the past decade. Many pundits are predicting the imminent collapse of the dollar. I am not one of those. There will be some sharp corrections in the markets, especially European sovereign debt. But I believe strongly that the powers that be will print whatever funds it takes to keep the system alive, even if it means higher inflation. And higher inflation without a corresponding means for people to increase their income means stagflation. Stagflation is where you have rising prices, but unlike hyperinflation where people can continue to pay those higher prices because the government's giving them more money each month, when you don't have ability to raise, then you have stagflation because people's quality of life suffers, the cost of living goes up, and they cannot adjust to it. They just suffer and spend less, and it's a self-defeating cycle. Now, I think we're heading for that kind of a slow decline. But don't make any long-term business or purchase plans that involve a lot of debt. I think it's important that people play it very, very conservative and start saving as much as they can and being prepared for hard times.
Well, I certainly agree with you, and I think that really we're entering a very, very uncertain period, and I just hope most of our listeners have gotten out of stocks because, of course, I think that certainly, even if they maintain their value, why the inflation will have eroded its purchasing power, and certainly there's nothing worse than stagflation or inflation, stagnant inflation, because of course it destroys the middle class, dependent upon their income from fixed investments, and especially for those people who are retired.
Well, our next subject, Stan, is why a Palestinian state won't bring peace. Of course, the big talk is about the United Nations going to vote on unilaterally declaring a Palestinian state. Well, the United Nations, as you, I'm sure, are aware, is the most highly politicized and fractious organization in the world, and only accomplishes anything when smaller nations succumb to the arm twisting by major powers in the Security Council, which is the only body, by the way, with final decision-making power. Within that body, the 5 permanent members of the Council, U.S., Britain, France, Russia, and China, have a unilateral veto power that can stop any vote from going into effect. Although a UN Security Council action to declare a Palestinian state is unlikely, given U.S. opposition, it is important to understand why such a unilateral creation would not bring peace, given the specific issues that cannot be resolved by declaring a state with fixed boundaries, difficult as those boundaries are to determine. So although the UN's stated purpose is to bring peace to the world, it was structured specifically to ensure permanent conflict, which serves globalist purposes in using war to drive out national sovereignty and establish, eventually, a militarized New World Order. For example, the UN Charter supposedly restricts membership to democratic nations, and yet the United States went out of its way to ensure that communist dictatorships were allowed in and given permanent veto-holding seats in the Security Council. The men selected to write the charter were secret globalists like Al-Jarhis, who's also a member of the Communist Party, but I think he joined the party basically to make the communists think he was one of them, but in fact he was a globalist. Incredibly, Russia, even after showing its tyrannical hand in post-war Europe, was granted a permanent seat on the Security Council, and Henry Kissinger then ensured that Communist China was given a permanent seat as part of the secret negotiations to end the Vietnam War, stripping Taiwan as the legitimate government in exile of China.
Well, I think that the great tragedy is, of course, the United Nations, I believe, is fraudulent. I believe that it is created as the basis for what the globalists want, and that is they want a world government. It hasn't worked very well. And certainly, almost since it was established, we've literally had hundreds of wars throughout the world and hundreds of conflicts. And they are not going to solve our problems. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, Yesterday, Obama spoke at the United Nations and spent most of his time justifying U.S. wars abroad while claiming all this was done in the pursuit of peace. He claimed at the time of a successful conclusion to all U.S. intervention in the Middle East was at hand. What a pipe dream, if not an outright lie. He praised Arab puppet regimes abroad in Yemen and Bahrain and further threatened Syria. He only made token reference to the major issue at hand, the Palestinian bid for statehood, by stating that Palestinian state could not be created by UN resolution. Well, the UN did just that with the creation of Israel in 1948, although the Arabs refused to accept it. And they attacked Israel in a bid to snuff out the newly declared Jewish state. And that attack failed. There would be another war were the UN to declare a Palestinian state, and Israel would not lose this one either. On the surface, it appears that Palestine had a chance to win the Security Council vote, since 9 Security Council members have already officially recognized Palestine. This includes Bosnia, China, India, Lebanon, South Africa, Brazil, Gabon, Nigeria, and Bosnia, all puppets of the communist realm. It would be a mistake, however, to assume that these nations will vote for nation status of Palestine. It is no secret that the U.S. has many means of pressuring or even blackmailing the smaller states into voting against Palestine. The major powers like Russia or China will probably abstain. Meanwhile, the Israeli Foreign Minister Danny Ayalon proposed a, quote, interim solution at the UN to placate the world press that was all in favor of Palestinian statehood. The solution by Israel was to allow the Palestinians to establish a state within the existing borders of Gaza and the West Bank and deal with all the difficult issues later. Well, of course, this does nothing more than maintain the status quo. There's no change with what happens right now. They're acting as an independent government, but they have no ability to rule themselves because they're an international welfare state. But it makes Israel look as if it is compromised. In fact, the existing borders are still undefined. The 1967 pre-war UN boundaries are unworkable since major Jewish settlements are already built miles into the occupied territories. Well, the world calls them occupied since they never intend to recognize Israel's right to permanently absorb this conquered land, one after the Arab states' war of aggression against Israel failed. In fact, all of the territories occupied by Israel were the result of lost wars started by the Arabs and lost. And yet, the UN doesn't seem to make decisions based upon who is the aggressor and who is the victim. It recognized all of Stalin's occupation of Eastern Europe as Soviet territory. How's that for hypocrisy? Well, the most important victory was driving the Jordanian army out of Jerusalem, where they were given, that was in 1969, and where they were given military control after the 1949 armistice. Jordan's British-trained army consistently turned a blind eye to Arab attacks on the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, and that went on for decades. So much for, international community being able to protect the Jews. Thus, Israel has good reason not to return strategic lands that would give a military advantage to the enemy, including Jerusalem. It is completely disingenuous for the Palestinians to claim that they need Jerusalem as their capital. It never was the capital before, and there never was a people known as the Palestinians in any case. That's a modern invention to further this particular Arab cause. So the issue of a Jerusalem as an Arab capital is thus one which Israel can never accede to. When any portion of the city...
Hold that thought. We'll be back here in just a moment. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Joel is simply talking about the situation as far as this idea of a Palestinian state is concerned. There's never been a true Palestinian state. The Palestinians are certainly not a true people. They're basically Jordanians and from other areas. And basically that Jerusalem is their capital. It has never been their capital. And basically, of course, we have a situation over there that sets all sorts of conflicts with the Jewish settlers well into the Palestinian area, and so there is no easy solution to the problem there. And we are doing everything. The United States is funding and training and arming a Palestinian army. We put $150 $1 million into training a Palestinian army to fight the Israelis, and then we give money to the Israelis so they can fight the Palestinians. And we have this situation, as we see throughout the whole of the Middle East, in fact, throughout so much of the world, where we arm both sides recently, transfer military technology to the communist nations, which one day will be used against us, and time and again you see America financing the enemy, creating the best enemies, and preparing the conflicts that lie ahead. Go right ahead, Joe.
Well, in all of this, it may appear as if I'm a unilateral supporter of Israel, and I am not. I'm stating what I believe have been the past causes of war, and essentially we've got two people that really, are relatively innocent relative to these, and we have a bunch of evil leaders on both sides. The Israeli government is as evil as they come, lies to their people constantly, and the Arabs as well incite their own people, and the real people in between catch the flack. But the issue of Jerusalem as an Arab capital is one which Israel could never really yield to. When any portion of the city was under Arab control in the past, there was always constant attacks upon the Jewish state. Neither should it be under international control. When the UN gave the British a mandate for control in 1948, they actively favored the Arabs who fought against the UN mandate that the British worked under. So the keeping of key military ground applies particularly to the Golan Heights, captured from Syria during the 1963 war. Syrian gunners and their Russian advisors would constantly shell, 1967 war is what I meant, Syrian gunners with their Russian advisors would constantly shell Jewish farms in the Jordan Valley below, and that military high ground should never be returned because it would become, a point of military aggression again. Another key issue that can't be resolved simply by declaring a Palestinian state are the water rights. Under a Palestinian state, Israel would lose most of its water rights. Israeli agriculture is based on irrigation and would dry up without water. Now, it's very interesting that over the years, the Israelis have attempted to get the Arabs, with very little success, to take up their irrigation type thing, and the Arabs preferred to stay with just grazing sheep and goats off the land and not getting into intensive agriculture. It really has made the Israelis a lot of money and the breadbasket of the entire region. Jordan finally acceded to letting the Israelis help them, and they've established a lot of irrigated farms on their side of the Jordan River and done very well, but no other Arab country has done that. Then there's the issue of the right of return. During the 1948 war, the Arabs drove out all Jews from certain towns, and the Israelis drove out even more Arabs from their villages. Both were wrong, and the original owners were not allowed to return. But the Israelis had a good reason not to allow the return. Being a democracy, the Arabs would have been the majority, voted as a bloc, and taken the country back with what they couldn't accomplish by force of arms. And that still applies today. Israel is a socialist democracy and thus has no absolute protection of rights, so the majority rules. That's why democracy in any country is so dangerous. When you lose the majority and when you have socialism, that gives that majority the power to take from everyone and distribute to their favorite constituents. So in culturally divided countries like Bosnia, Kosovo, and Israel, that becomes a recipe for war, one minority pitted against another. Because Israel doesn't have the proper level of protection of property rights and individual rights, it uses force to keep. What I'm saying by that, by the way, is that if you have a proper constitution of rights, it doesn't matter who's in charge of the government, nobody can take and redistribute land to anybody else. You see, so everybody's rights are protected. And so you don't have this him versus us because he's in charge of government and they control and they're giving most of the benefits to the Serbs or the Kosovarians or the Arabs or the Bosnians. You have none of that. Everybody's an individual. Everybody has their rights protected, and the government can't take and redistribute to anyone.
And that is certainly so very, very true. And of course, the difficulty is what you're really going to have to do one day is, I think, is going to have separate countries. The Arabs are going to live in one area, the Israelis another. The worst thing we possibly could have done with Iraq was try to take the Kurds and the Shia Muslims and the Sunni Muslims to make them all into one country, which ensures there's going to be permanent conflict there. That's why the British did this after the First World War, and this is why we're doing it. We don't want a peaceful solution. We want conflict, divide, and conquer. Well, this is Dr. Stan. I guess it's Joel Skousen. Joel, it looks to me like an insoluble problem. We can talk about, suddenly trying to establish a system of government where everybody's rights are protected. But, you're never going to get the Arabs and the Jews to live together peacefully, not until the Lord returns.
Well, and that's my opinion, too. And a lot of that is because of, I think, some real cultural things indigenous to both groups. Let me skip down to a portion of tomorrow's brief to discuss that. Let's see.
Go right ahead there.
Yeah, I'm trying to
find your place in your notes.
Find this portion where I'm going to change to. Okay, here it is. First of all, the leaders of both the Palestinians and Israelis, I believe, are evil and are not serving the true interests of their people. All the top leaders are personally corrupt. This has been going on ever since, even Yasser Arafat had a big bank account set up by the Israelis, by the way. Mark Rich, by the way, who was pardoned by Clinton, helped set all that bank account stuff up in Switzerland. And Arafat was putting away millions of dollars that he was taking from international aid meant for the Palestinians and stashing away his own personal bank account. That still goes on both sides. So they're all true corrupt, and there's various conspiracies within their government to dupe their own people. Second, there are serious flaws within the two different cultures that inhibit rational, sane thinking. On the Arab side, there's this problem of too many masses of childlike people who can be incited to riot and to act in the most inhumane ways toward man and animal. And I've been to Palestine many times. And when I was there, one of the times, I was witness to a very horrible scene. A group of Arab kids, about anywhere from 8 to 10 years old, and they were standing around with sticks and knives, and they were torturing a cat and just jumping up and down gleefully and stripping its skin off and cutting it, while it was alive and catching it. It was just the most horrible scene, and yet I thought, I've never seen that in another culture. The kids just get together and they think that's the greatest sport, to sit there and torture an animal. And I thought, well, it's not. I found out later it wasn't just animals. When one of the Israeli soldiers was captured in Gaza, he was taken down and dumped out of a window, and then they stripped him of his clothes and they started skinning him alive. And
hold that thought. We'll be right back here. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and certainly Joel is simply talking about the fact that you have different cultures between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and there's certainly an amount of cruelty, and certainly in the Muslim faith. And as he described some scenes he had seen when he was over there visiting, where a group of Palestinian young people, children, were actually torturing an animal. He talks about instances where they've actually captured Israeli soldiers, and at least on one instance, and tried to skin him alive. This sort of things, as if somehow this is simply a matter of entertainment. We're dealing with different cultures because, of course, these people worship a different God. But go right ahead, Joel.
Well, I don't blame this so much even on the religion of the Muslim religion. Really, what I'm trying to describe is when you get people of a certain mental coefficient that's childlike and they never rise above that, they can be incited to things that just normal, deeper thinking people can't. And I'm not saying that all Arabs are like this at all. I'm not trying to generalize. There are some very intelligent, sensitive Arab people. But I'm just saying there's a mass of people at an intelligent quotient level that's low enough and too childlike where they just get giddy and silly over things like torturing animals and other things that just doesn't happen in other cultures. Now,
I think we have to be very careful being critical of other countries for torturing people after having read Major General Taguba's report about what happened at that prison in Baghdad. But go ahead.
No, I understand. The torture isn't unique, but clearly, even those, I'm talking about being childlike in giddiness and gleefulness at torture. You see, there are people who are yes men and who do things like that, as Nazi soldiers did torture and other things, even though it wasn't light, it was an exception to their culture. And I'm just saying, I've never seen anyone except, someone mentally deranged take glee of something, but this is something that I saw, a whole group of kids, it was their culture just to be jumping up and down with joy and entertaining themselves with the torture of an animal. And I'm just saying that that's a cultural thing, not based upon religion, but it's more based upon a childlike quotient of mentality that can easily be, drugged by this mental, game of doing things, get carried away. And that's the way that you have this rabid riot culture, that they can be whipped up into hatred against Israelis. Now,
before you go on, Joel, I do want you to get out, tell our listeners how they can get in touch with you, how they can subscribe to the World Affairs Brief, and then we'll get right back to the report for this week. But before I forget it, otherwise I'll forget, and I want you to tell them also how they can get your books, which we just happen to carry on strategic relocation, the secure home, etc. Go right ahead.
Okay, well, let's take a break and talk about that. People can see my World Affairs Brief on my website, worldaffairsbrief.com, and then get a free sample issue of what we're talking about by emailing me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com. My books are showcased on my website, joelskousen.com. That's JOELSKOUSEN. My biggest book is The Secure Home, 700 pages of everything from A to Z on high security and self-sufficiency in home and equipment. The bestseller, however, is Strategic Relocation. The new third edition is an all-color map edition with even a new section on international retreating. Just covers everything one needs to know about developing contingency plans for retreating or second homes, or how to stay within an existing culture and be able to spare yourself when major things happen. The last book is How to Implement a High-Security Shelter in the Home. It's a architectural plan book on how to do a safe room within an existing basement. And all three of these books are available from Radio Liberty.
By calling 1-800-544-8927, 1-800-544-8927, and they really are among the best-selling books we carry. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, and my criticism of this commonality of the masses, I'm not talking about the educated people, and it's not just a matter of education. This is more of whatever's inbred in cultures, it isn't bred out very easily. But there is this tendency to be able to be whipped up into a riot, into hatred, that is very, very typical of this particular culture. Now, while Israeli youth, I had never seen, and I asked a lot, I said, have you ever seen this happen in Israel? Because, Israel is very much a Middle East country. There's a lot of things that are unholy in the Holy Land. The streets are filled with cars jockeying for position, honking and cursing, shaking fists are common. It's not like the occasional road rage in America, which is the exception. It's much more common to a Middle East culture. And people just don't think anything about it. Yelling and screaming and honking your horn and shaking your fist at people is just part of their way of life. But actually, in Israel, there are two groups of cultures. Those native to the area who are very much Middle Eastern stereotyped, and those that are transplants from the West, either from America or Europe. The Westernized Jews act like normal people in the West do. They're thoughtful, hard to get worked up about something, very susceptible to establishment propaganda in the mainstream news, laid back, hardworking businessmen, but they're very much like Westerners. They are as duped as their leaders, by their leaders who lie, with, of course, some notable exceptions in Israel who I met who are not duped, who do see through this. But isn't that interesting that they can't be whipped up into rioting, they can't be whipped up into torturing and getting giddy about it, but they can be lied to and believed, and they can be fooled, and that's why I don't have any hope for these areas. The Arabs are mentally incapable, speaking of the common people, of resisting the incitements of evil leaders, constantly driving them towards hatred of the Jews. And by the way, some of that's very justified by the recent targeting of civilians by the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, in Gaza, and in the last war in Lebanon, Israeli aircraft went after civilian targets and bombed them purposefully. The Jews are led to believe, in contrast by their leaders, that they always act in their behalf. while the truth is that they're always being lied to constantly. Their leaders on both the right and the left are in league with the globalists of the Anglo-American establishment. The best of the settlers are constantly being betrayed by agent provocateurs from their own government, from the very right-wing government, by the way, that claims that they're protecting the settlers. And often they're thrown off their illegal settlements, about which they had been receiving private assurances from the government that they would be left alone. That's what's really going on in Israel in a nutshell. And it can only lead to war.
I fear that you're correct. Go right ahead.
Well, understanding the relationship between Israel and the U.S. is actually very complex. It is not as if Israel always supports Israel. In fact, they do that in lip service. There's a very powerful Jewish lobby in the United States. No politician can get elected without kowtowing to Israel. But in fact, the U.S. has worked both sides of the problem for years. They financed, as you said, terrorists against Israel. They financed the Palestinians. They financed Israel. They financed Egypt. And you can't figure this out until you understand the conflict creation agenda that these globalists have. It's out of conflict that they're able to intercede and put in international constraints upon nations and take away national sovereignty and bind down nations to the control of the UN. Both governments, the U.S. and Israeli government, have long been controlled by forces very different from what the public sees. Just as George W. Bush was put into office to fool conservatives with his false Christian conservative credentials, so Obama was installed to divert the inevitable backlash against Bush and divert it with false promises of change, which never came, except for the worst, of course. The Obama administration is pursuing the same basic agenda as the previous three administrations, only under different tactics and rhetoric. In like manner, Israelis are fooled into thinking that Benjamin Netanyahu is a right-wing leader. But he, too, is only playing that role, just as past leaders, both of the Israeli right and the left. For Netanyahu to keep up the facade as the champion of the right, he has to play to his constituent demands on the right and assert time and again that he will not cross certain red lines, such as no divided Jerusalem, no right of return, no abandonment of Israeli settlements. But little do Israelis know that the former administrations of Israel have already signed secret agreements to abandon many settlements and give up Jerusalem to international control and cede almost all of the occupied territories back to Palestinian control. Now, that's according to Barry Chamish, who has more whistleblower contacts in Israel than anyone I know. That, then, is the real cause of the fake rift. Benjamin Netanyahu needs a crisis to have an excuse to betray his red line commitment, just as he did when he signed the Y agreements with President Clinton during his first tenure as prime minister. A lot of people don't remember that Netanyahu in the 90s was the prime minister of Israel, and that he fell out of power because he signed the Y agreement and compromised with President Clinton and the Palestinians, and the voters voted him out. He has to move carefully.
I'm going to hold you there. Yeah. We're just going to have to be back here in just a moment here.
Okay.
Go right ahead.
Well, so you see, he's back in office again. He's promising stronger than ever to pretend to defend the right-wing positions of the pro-settler and pro-Israeli position. But he has to move carefully so that when he does compromise, he appears to have no choice. The media is promoting the notion that Netanyahu has to knuckle under to U.S. demands or lose the protection of the U.S. This allows Netanyahu, in turn, to convince his right-wing allies that they have to support him in making painful compromises. So, Israel's suggestion yesterday of granting Palestinians recognition as a state is the first attempt at compromising Israel into something it won't be able to back out of later.
All right, so what's going to happen?
Well, I think basically, Stan, that nothing is going to happen. I think the Palestinian, let me put it this way. Obama's going to be in real trouble if he has to use his veto tomorrow when the Security Council votes on that. That's why I think they're twisting arms to all of the pro-Palestinian members of the non-permanent members of the Security Council to make sure that they can get them to vote against it. And then the U.S. can say, like, well, we didn't really stop this. That was the will of the people. Now, if they vote for it, I think Israel or U.S. will have to use its veto, and then there'll be a major rift between the Palestinians will no longer ever try to work with the United States. I think it will be a major tectonic shift in the political thing, and I think essentially either way this turns out, the Palestinians have basically said there's not going to be any negotiations. I think they're going to have war. And I think, frankly, that Israel will precipitate the war by attacking Iran. I think they've been planning for this for the past 2 or 3 years. In fact, there's some indication that goes clear back to 2004 that the globalists have been demanding that Israel attack Iran so that they can remove Iran as a major source of oil for China and in other ways exacerbate the hatred of the Arabs towards America. By the way, this whole process of intervening in America is not just for intervening in the Middle East and in Africa. It's not just for oil control, although that is one of the secondary motives. But a lot of it is to antagonize the rest of the world against the United States so that when China and Russia want to attack the West, as they're planning to do in the next decade, that they'll have the excuse to do so because the U.S. will have made themselves the bully of the world.
Well, it's sort of an ominous thought, but I certainly would not disagree with you at all. I think we're entering very difficult times. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, certainly the Palestinian state can never be self-sustaining. It will always be beholden to Israel for its jobs. A lot of people don't realize that there are hardly any jobs in Gaza. But almost everybody has to go across the border through the checkpoints to work for the Israelis. Even when the Israeli government kicked out all of the Jewish settlers in Gush Katif, in the Gaza Strip along the coast where they had all these productive greenhouses, they're just standing there in a mess today. They haven't taken over and used even what the Jews did in terms of making these very wealthy greenhouses that were supplying most of the kosher food around the world.
Hold that thought. Go right ahead.
Well, the Palestinians have done nothing with it. It's just incredible waste of infrastructure that had happened there. But they have no industry within Gaza. They have, other than an arms industry, a small arms industry to make missiles and rockets to shoot over into Israel. And a lot of that comes through tunnels via Egypt, at least the raw materials and the explosives. But they have no oil in themselves. They have no electricity. All of their electricity is generated in Israel. So really they don't have the means to be an independent state. They'll always be dependent on Israel. And they'll always be a welfare state of the international community. They'll always be a haven for terrorists because of the eternal hatred that Arab leaders have exacerbated against the Jews, and, frankly, because of some of the injustices of the IDF in being too ruthless in attacking civilians when they should have only been attacking the terrorists. Certainly there's blame on both sides, Stan. The Jewish leaders themselves, belonging to a globalist clique, have fomented and provoked violence and aided and abetted terror through black operations of the Mossad or the Shin Bet. Most Americans don't know that the Israelis, using money laundered through Mark Rich, who Clinton Pargan set up that secret bank account for Yasser Arafat, they just don't know about this playing both sides of the thing. The U.S. also played a role in saving Arafat from destruction on several occasions. Sure, there were always superficial excuses our leaders used to explain away these actions to save terror for another day, but the real reason is the so-called peace process is a process of conflict creation. There never will be peace between Arab and Jews as long as their respective leaders are controlled by this agenda, using war to build a new world order. And they even target Israel, I think, strongly. They're looking for the time when Israel will have to call upon international assistance to save them from a major missile attack from Syria or Egypt or Hamas in Lebanon. And then once you get an international order of peacekeepers in there, they intend to continue to maintain control over Jerusalem so it becomes an international city.
I think that point is so vitally important. People must understand that the globalists who control the United States want conflict. We finance both sides all the time so we can have conflict. Then we can point to that and say, look at that terrible conflict. Look at all those poor innocent children who died. What we need is a global government. Without ever pointing out that we've usually financed both sides in all of these battles so we would have the conflict. And until people understand we have actually funded finance and arm the Palestinians so they could fight the Israelis who we funded and financed and armed. None of this makes sense. We gave the Palestinians, well, recently $150 million, but of course we gave phenomenal amounts to Arafat so we could keep the conflict going, certainly when he was about to be destroyed. Certainly during the Reagan administration, why we demanded a ceasefire, and we evacuated the Palestinian army to Tunisia so they could reform and regroup, and then come back to fight again. Ladies and gentlemen, it's all smoke and mirrors. And, of course, it's all about creating conflicts to justify the world government. Until you understand that, you can't understand what's going on or what lies ahead, the terrible war that's coming for America. We'll be back in just a moment with Joel Skousen to wrap up today's program right here at Radio Liberty. Well, Joel, you have 3 minutes for you to wrap up the program. These are certainly exciting times, and this vote that's going to be I guess it's just tomorrow in the UN, is a very, very important one. Go right ahead.
Well, one of the things that most Americans don't realize is that the secret army of the United States has grown to be almost as large as the visible army. Even as Obama claimed in his UN speech, the U.S. will withdraw in a few short years from Iraq and Afghanistan. The spreading of U.S. attack drone bases around the world belies that claim. The United States is widening its drone bases in the Horn of Africa and Arabian Peninsula to target, quote, Al-Qaeda affiliates. Al-Qaeda is the excuse all, justify all reason for everything. There are going to be, drone bases in Somalia, in Yemen, in Ethiopia, and I can tell you what this really means, Stan. This means that this is a sign that the U.S. is going to continue its intervention in other nations in Africa until all become puppet regimes, as in Libya and Egypt. If the American people knew how large America's covert military forces would be, they would be shocked. They would be enraged that they were taxed for the cost, but they'll never see that tax. The administration has been expanding its black budgets until they are nearly a third of the regular budget, and none of it is ever discussed in Congress.
No, that's tragic, and there's so many things that are never discussed, and most people have never even thought of the implications of the fact that we do have a black budget and we do have these drone bases, and here's what it means by which we can just silently kill people all throughout the world. Not only that, of course, we have our special forces units, very trained, efficient, professional soldiers, mercenaries who will just kill whoever they're told to kill. And I think that's a frightening thing, that we have these stationed in nations all throughout the world to keep the leaders of the world in line. They understand what's going on. It's just the average American doesn't understand.
And that's why America's more and more hated. It's not because of our freedoms, but because it's this secret, illegal intervention that is deeply resented by other governments around the world.
Well, at least we have the opportunity to bring the information out. I appreciate so much your keeping us abreast of things. You've got about 30 seconds to wrap up the program.
Well, there was another piece of disinformation, Stan. Today they revealed the names of Alfredo Francis Bukowski and Michelle Ann Casey, both the CIA analysts, and they're saying these are the people responsible for starting the black sites and the enhanced interrogation of torture. I mean, this is so bogus. This is done only to make them scapegoats for the higher-ups who started all this. There's no way that some mid-level analysts ever did this on their own. But
You're
that's an example of what happened.
You're absolutely right. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. God bless. Well, that was Dr. Joel Skousen, and he won't be with us tomorrow, but he will be doing the Thursday programs, and hopefully in December, Joel will start doing the Saturday program as well. But pardon me, I should say the Friday program as well. But this is the time when I need to, Chris, remind our listeners we are moving into a very, very dangerous period. And believe me, financially, an awful lot of people are going to get wiped out. You need to make preparations and do not tarry. do not put you're making your decisions off, because the whole world financial system is beginning to crumble as we know it. And inflation, the destruction of the value of our currency, the change of the structure of international finance is going to change. And the dollar, certainly sooner or later, is going to lose its reserve status. So then, of course, we hope that many of you out there will want to join the Radio Liberty family of supporters. We're primarily listener-supported, and if you'd like, of course, to become a member of the Radio Liberty family, our number 1-800-544-8927, and when you do, you sort of partner in maintaining our 65 outlets we have every week as we reach out across America. So at least somewhere in America, people are getting the truth. If you haven't read my book, Brotherhood of Darkness, you need to get it, you need to read it, you need to hear my talk on the dark secret and on the forbidden secret, and the syllabuses that go with both of those talks. They're available by calling 1-800-544-8927. We are having an all-day conference here and in the North Shore of Monterey Bay at the Aptos Seascape Golf Course, the convention center, on the 23rd of October, and we're getting people signing up, and we hope that if you're able to come, you will. Certainly, you only have, I think, until tomorrow will be the last day you'll be able to get the special rate at the Seacliff Inn. So call today and get the telephone number, because after tomorrow it'll be too late to get the special rate. Our telephone number, 1-800-544-8927. If you're planning on coming, we have to know, because we're serving lunch. So give us a call and make your reservation to come to the October 23rd conference. So we're bringing in speakers. We're going to have we're going to go from about 8:30 in the morning till 5:30 or 6 in the evening. You'll have an opportunity to learn a lot and to meet a lot of people who feel as you do that America's in real trouble, and hopefully you'll agree with us. We are involved in a spiritual battle. There really are dark spiritual forces working behind the scenes. If you haven't seen our 4-CD set on the supernatural, let me recommend it to you. If you haven't seen the book Satanic Crimes, or seen the 4-CD set on Satanic Crimes are important, we have Malachi Martin's excellent book, Hostage to the Devil. We certainly recommend you read this. It was one of the first things that gave me insight into what was going on around the world, but I really didn't understand until I read Constance Cumby's book, The Hidden Dangers of the Rainbow. It's out of print, but we do have second-hand copies that are available. We have a 4-CD set of my interviews with Constance called The Aquarian Conspiracy. The Aquarian Conspiracy, that's what they call it. And then, of course, we have my DVD that Constance did. It's called The Emergence, going into the fact that there is a new world leader coming, a new world leader. And if you'd like to get more information and get those, our telephone number is 1-800-544-8927, 1-800-544-8927, and we'd certainly make your reservations there. And again, remember our all-day conference on the 23rd of October. And get your reservations in right now. And today is the last day you can make your reservations at the Aptos Seascape Golf Course. Today is the last day, so if you're going to come, why, give us a call today, and you'll have to get make the call this evening. So this is Dr. Stan asking you to pray for America, to pray for revival, but please pray for Radio Liberty, for our provision and protection.